The initial instance of denying my spouse was met with absolute muteness. He merely remained motionless in the blackness of the room, his form angled away from me, drawing breath with the deliberate rhythm of a man reaching an internal conclusion. The wind pressed continuously against the exterior siding. The small metal click of the cooking stove radiated from the downstairs kitchen, and the rhythmic thump of my own pulse sounded incredibly loud in my ears. I braced myself for an outburst of temper, an argument, or any tangible reaction whatsoever, but he offered absolutely no response. Within our social framework, an absolute absence of interaction represented the most perilous response a husband could present. The subsequent instance of withholding compliance transpired slightly over a week later, and another 8 days after that. The structural consequences enacted by Amish husbands against wives who refuse them a second time became painfully clear. This understanding came to me in the indirect, guarded manner that information always travels among plain women, whispered by a peer who pulled me into a secluded spot during a communal barn construction, delivering her words without ever fully meeting my gaze. I grew up inside this world, specifically within an Old Order Amish settlement in Geauga County, Ohio, entering marriage at 19 and ultimately engineering my departure at 26 with a single piece of luggage and a heavy internal quietude. This narrative serves as a vessel to finally speak the realities our culture strictly forbade us from sharing outside our homes. If you value discovering these authentic accounts from behind the traditional prayer cap, please pass this message along to someone who needs to hear it. For those who were socialized within a faith tradition that characterized a female's refusal as a moral transgression, sharing your story below helps illuminate these hidden dynamics. It is necessary to recognize the vast divergence between the mainstream world and our culture regarding this boundary, as an outsider's refusal typically terminates the discussion immediately. Within the boundaries of my upbringing, however, that negative response merely initiated an entirely different systemic process. This reaction did not manifest as physical aggression or vocal rage, but as something far more insidious, a gradual, collective withdrawal of the entire neighborhood's warmth, occurring so subtly that you failed to recognize your isolation until you were already cast out completely. The theological framework governing marriage in our community relies entirely upon a single scriptural passage endlessly reinforced from the pulpit, dictating that a wife must submit while a husband must lead. That single concept defines the entire arrangement, completely devoid of any balancing scriptural mandates regarding her physical comfort, her exhaustion, or the days when her physical form is entirely depleted. The presiding bishop of our district explicitly declared, during a service, that a married woman who denies her spouse is effectively unlocking an entryway for demonic influence. Standing there at 17 years old, observing my own clasped hands in my lap, I fiercely resolved that I would never unlock that entryway, promising myself to be an exemplary wife who would never provide a reason for censure. My marriage to Jonas occurred in the spring following my 19th birthday. He was 22, the second offspring of a dairy farming lineage situated 3 properties away, characterized by restrained physical movements and a severe facial expression that rarely softened into a smile. The community consensus dictated that he would provide an exceptionally stable partnership, leaving me to feel incredibly fortunate. Our nuptials took place on a May Tuesday, a gathering of 300 individuals inside my father's barn, featuring traditional meals of roasted chicken, creamed celery, and an assortment of pies. By the time the final carriage departed our property, I had been functioning without sleep for 19 hours, my lower limbs severely swollen within the confines of my newly acquired black footwear. The initial year of our partnership functioned primarily as an introductory period where Jonas displayed a quiet brand of patience as I mastered domestic management, and he adjusted to returning from agricultural labor to find a prepared meal waiting. We welcomed a son prior to our initial anniversary, followed by a daughter a mere 14 months later. By the age of 22, I was managing 2 toddlers simultaneously, overseeing a demanding household, preparing 3 daily meals, cultivating a large garden, and washing laundry by hand using a wringer machine my father had constructed, all while married to a spouse who could not fathom why I occasionally drifted into sleep at the supper table with an eating utensil still gripped in my hand. On the night I first voiced a refusal, my day had commenced at 4 a.m. following 3 consecutive nights of tending to a sick infant, while my older child battled an intermittent fever. Furthermore, I had processed nearly 50 quarts of tomatoes that same afternoon, leaving my spine radiating an agony that felt entirely permanent. When Jonas initiated physical contact in the darkness, I placed a hand gently upon his wrist and softly stated that I desperately required sleep instead. His physical frame instantly locked into complete immobility, a detail that remains permanently etched in my memory, as his respiratory pattern shifted and the entire room seemed to freeze under the weight of the moment. Without uttering a syllable, he rotated his body away from me, remaining in that posture until the dawn. I lay awake for hours adjacent to him, tracking the ceiling contours, listening to his breathing, and wondering if I had initiated a fracture that could never be repaired. By the time I descended the stairs the following morning, he had already retreated to the barn, subsequently consuming both his morning and midday meals in absolute silence, without ever making eye contact. He interacted normally with the children but acted as though I was completely non-existent, a pattern that persisted across 5 consecutive days. On the 6th morning, my mother arrived at the household bearing a container of freshly baked bread, placing it upon the table while observing my movements with the hyper-vigilant scrutiny common to mothers who recognize internal distress. She eventually inquired if harmony prevailed between Jonas and myself, and lacking the capacity to practice deception toward her, I affirmed that everything was fine. She offered a slow nod before delivering a solitary metaphor that concluded her visit, warning me that a wife who permits coldness to enter her home possesses no right to complain when the entire structure freezes over. With that, she retrieved her empty container, exited through the rear door, and refrained from looking back at me. I remained seated at the kitchen table for a long duration following her departure, entirely unable to fully decode her meaning in that specific moment. Yet deep beneath my physical exhaustion, I recognized that a profound warning had been issued, originating from a source far vaster than my mother alone. It emanated from the collective community, from the established order of things, and from the endless, unbroken lineage of plain wives extending back through generations who had been systematically told in their own domestic spaces by their own mothers that they were personally responsible for the emotional frost they endured. That evening, when Jonas initiated contact once more, I offered neither a refusal nor an affirmation, remaining entirely motionless and allowing the encounter to proceed before turning toward the wall to weep with a quietude that ensured even the infant resting in the adjacent cradle remained undisturbed. Slightly over a week later, a second refusal escaped my lips, driven entirely by a degree of physical depletion that caused my body to react before my rational mind could intervene. I simply stated that I was incapable of compliance, prompting him to rotate away, once more, as the quiet punishment resumed. However, this iteration of silence possessed a distinct edge. The following morning, my sister-in-law Rachel arrived with her offspring for an hour-long visit, completely avoiding any direct mention of Jonas. Instead, she pointedly discussed a woman residing 2 districts away whose spouse had formally petitioned the ministerial leadership to intervene in their marriage, detailing the severe social hardships that family endured subsequently, including the mandatory involvement of the woman's paternal relatives. She delivered this entire chronicle while consuming coffee at my table, never once establishing direct eye contact, executing the precise method plain women utilize to convey a systemic warning. 3 days later, the bishop's spouse arrived at my home entirely unannounced, offering no explicit reason for her visit. As she consumed her beverage and inquired about the offspring, her gaze slowly evaluated the cleanliness of my kitchen floor, the state of the tableware, and the dust accumulating upon the pie cabinet. She then softly remarked that a wife's primary spiritual obligation is to ensure her husband's internal peace, with all other concerns existing as secondary priorities. Following this statement, she completed her beverage and departed. The communal barn construction occurred the subsequent Saturday, and it was there, behind the extensive banquet tables where the women were organizing the midday meal, that a senior woman named Lydia, with whom I possessed only a passing acquaintance, placed down a tray of bread and positioned herself directly beside me. Speaking entirely without looking at my face, she instructed me to listen carefully to a truth that no one had ever granted her. She explained that a single refusal is interpreted merely as physical fatigue, which a reasonable spouse can comprehend. However, a secondary refusal is interpreted as a behavioral pattern, and a behavioral pattern functions as the exact topic the men analyze when congregating by the boundary fences after Sunday services. By the third instance of denial, the husband's mother will intervene. By the fourth, his father will arrive. And by the fifth, the bishop himself will appear at the household, at which stage personal explanations cease to matter, leaving your fate entirely in the hands of their collective decision. She paused to adjust a loaf of bread upon the tray before continuing, noting that our culture does not utilize physical violence, opting instead for a methodology that is far more difficult to endure. They systematically extract the emotional warmth from your household, piece by piece, until the resulting isolation leaves you willing to concede to any demand simply to feel connected again. Your spouse terminates all communication. Your maternal in-laws cease their visitations. Your sisters suddenly become unavailable on days previously shared. The congregation intentionally relocates to the opposite side of the meeting room, and your own mother begins observing you with the disappointment reserved for a barren field. Eventually, you awaken to realize that your entire social reality has fallen completely silent, leaving only a solitary pathway open: the return to his bed. Walking through that door restores the communal warmth, causing everyone to smile upon you once more, allowing you to rationalize the capitulation as a personal choice. She finally directed her gaze toward me for a solitary moment, stating flatly that it was never a genuine choice, though our language completely lacks a vocabulary to define that reality, forcing us instead to label it as being an exemplary wife. She then retrieved her empty tray and walked away, leaving me standing behind the long banquet table, with my hands gripping the edge of the wood, as the entire structural foundation of my existence rearranged itself behind my eyes. I wish I could state that this newfound realization prompted me to return home that evening, to confront Jonas in an honest dialogue that transformed our marriage. Instead, the reality is that I returned home, prepared the evening meal, bathed the offspring, and lay down beside him in the darkness, allowing the communal warmth to return, because Lydia had spoken the unvarnished truth. The socioeconomic penalty of continued refusal was an extraction I simply lacked the strength to endure at that stage, burdened by two small infants, completely devoid of independent financial resources, and facing a social order that would fiercely protect my spouse while casting me out completely. Consequently, I remained for an additional 4 years, welcoming another child into the world, and learning to interpret my husband's silences with the precision other individuals apply to reading weather patterns. I mastered the capacity to discern from the mere angle of his shoulders at the supper table whether the impending night would be one of easy survival or an ordeal I would need to mentally brace against, successfully adopting the community's label of an exemplary wife. Yet, deep inside, within the psychological space Lydia had validated behind the bread table, a small and resilient resolve began to cultivate completely hidden from public view. My departure was executed when my youngest child reached the age of 3, The social excommunication manifested precisely according to Lydia's description, though on a much grander scale. My maternal correspondence was returned entirely unopened. My siblings crossed the street to avoid contact when encounters occurred in town, and my father looked directly through my physical form as though I were made of glass during the singular instance our paths crossed again. In the subsequent years, however, I discovered that the quiet punishment enacted against me and against thousands of plain wives across countless farmhouses every single season possesses a distinct definition in the outside world. My therapist supplied these definitions slowly and deliberately, naming the experiences as coercive control, emotional withdrawal utilized as a punitive tool, community-enforced compliance, and a total subversion of consent created by making the cost of refusal entirely unbearable. Within my birth community, none of this vocabulary existed, as we possessed only a solitary word for this dynamic: matrimony. It is vital to be precise here, as this narrative is not an indictment characterizing every plain husband as inherently cruel. Jonas was not a malicious individual, but rather a man constructed entirely within the same culture of absolute silence that shaped me, executing a prescribed marital script exactly as it had been taught to him. The bishop who delivered that sermon during my youth was not a monster, but an aging man duplicating dictums passed down to him through generations. The mothers, sisters-in-law, and leaders' wives who arrive at your kitchen bearing warnings are not villains, but women who once stood in your exact position, who once permitted the emotional cold to enter, and who ultimately learned to characterize the restoration of communal warmth as love, because acknowledging the alternative reality would have completely shattered their psychological well-being. The system itself is the destructive mechanism, not the individuals operating within it, a system that systematically transforms a woman's personal refusal into a collective community crisis, characterizes her physical exhaustion as an opening for evil, and renders total compliance the only safe position available. For those who navigated an upbringing where your physical form was managed as institutional property rather than your own sacred domain, your experience is recognized. If you ever lay motionless in the darkness beside a partner, offering an affirmation simply because you lacked the stamina required to survive the penalty of a refusal, your experience is recognized. If you were systematically taught that exemplary womanhood required the continuous minimization of your own existence until nothing remained with which to mount a refusal, your experience is recognized as well. You were never weak. You were merely executing survival strategies within a framework explicitly designed to ensure that refusal carried an unbearable cost. Lydia passed away 2 years prior to my departure, and attending her funeral at the rear of the service in my traditional attire, I watched her body be committed to the earth adjacent to the spouse she had accompanied for over 5 decades. Standing there, my mind returned to that morning behind the bread table, reflecting on the brief moment she met my gaze and the terrible, beautiful gift she presented by voicing the truth aloud. She is the fundamental reason I comprehended exactly what I was severing ties with when I finally chose to walk away. Tell me what elements of this account resonated with you, or if you possessed your own source of truth when no one else would speak it. Claim your independence deliberately, for your refusal is a complete and valid boundary in its own right, and no domestic space, social collective, or silent partner in the dark possesses the authority to diminish its validity.